All right, everybody, welcome in. And we're going to begin the final talk for the 2 day scheduled World Astrology Summit. But I just want to remind you that we do have a 21st talk that's going to be scheduled after this conference closes. My expectation is that we'll be offering that 21st talk, which is going to be touching on themes related to uh, Iran and the United States and Israel's strikes on Iran. That will be an additional talk. I mean, when we built the schedule, it was in like December, January, and we did not yet have full view into where things were going to be around the Aries ingress this weekend. But I do want to make sure that we have an opportunity to talk about that subject. So I'm going to get that organized for mid-April. And I'll just ask you to watch your inbox. You will all receive an invitation to that webinar free of charge. So it'll be just a closed group of everybody who was here with us for the summit. Um, Now, let's open up this discussion about birthright citizenship and the U.S. Supreme Court. This is a really major thing that's happening in the U.S. right now. Um, so Donald Trump wins the election, allegedly. I mean, I have so many questions increasingly about what anything touching. I generally trust elections. I'm not an elections denier. I am with anything Trump does. I now put a question mark. I don't take anything at face value. In fact, some things I take at face value simply because, that's like the closest we can get to what probably is a real picture, especially if face value is what he's saying it's definitely not. But I just think that there's some trust issues that we can all possibly understand with this particular individual and those within his orbit. Now, so he will have won the election in 2024 and was inaugurated in January of 2025. So, a couple of things just to make sure that we're on the same page. When I'm looking at inauguration charts, one thing that drove me crazy when I first start getting into mundane astrology was that American presidents are elected and then inaugurated at the exact same time on the same date every 4 years. This has a particular like there's a pattern that gets kind of pulled into this, which maybe some would find very useful, but for me, I just find it very cumbersome and frustrating. The pattern that's difficult for me is the sun is always on the midheaven. It's always, I think, at 20 degrees of Aquarius, or sorry, very early degrees of Aquarius, like 2 or 3 or something like this. Um, and the angles are always the same. That's the real issue for me is that the angles are the same. It also means that Venus and Mars are effectively doing this dance where they're interposing between the same signs. I mean, if you look at inauguration charts year after year, pile them up, go back for the last, 100 years and pull January 20th at noon in DC every 4 years and just look at the positions of Venus and Mars, what you will begin to realize is there is a very important dynamic and cycle that's being told between those two planets and also planets like Jupiter and Saturn, which are moving at a consistent rate if we're averaging them over years. So something very powerful there. But what I like to see is what is happening on the angles. I want to see something that is unique. I want to see something that is likely to jump out and provide new insight. And also to help differentiate between, this particular cycle, for instance, and what happened 4 years ago and 8 years ago. So, what I use then is the preceding full moon because that could happen at any point. The full moon could be in Leo, it could be in Cancer, it will only be in one of those two signs, or it could be a new moon that's in Aquarius or a new moon that's in Capricorn. So suddenly we have more options about the different sun moon relationships. And then importantly, when the sun and moon come into an exact either conjunction or opposition, we have established angles that can be very useful for us. So this is the inauguration chart that I'll be referencing because I think it's got a lot of really important signatures that have been repeatedly triggered and repeatedly struck, and it might be a little bit challenging to figure out, for instance, why was 27 degrees of Cancer, if you've been watching the activity of the Trump administration when it's been doing anything involving violent activity, when it's been doing anything related to, well, I mean, anything Mars related, to be honest, you'll find a transit. The moon is at 27 degrees of Cancer, or Mars is in square or opposition to that particular point, or the moon will be maybe having just recently had a lunation either in Cancer or Capricorn at that same point. So, I without looking at this particular chart, you might not appreciate how does that happen? How did it build? But for me, I mean, if you looked at the lunation chart just before the election, Mars was at 29 Cancer on the ninth cusp. And then at the inauguration full moon, it's a moon Mars conjunction in opposition to the sun. And that's on the ascendant. So this moon Mars conjunction on the ascendant. This is one of those things that I think actually, if I had noticed this before, because I said Harris was going to win, just full disclosure. I really wanted her to win. I was kind of taking an approach to political astrology where I actually, kind of wanted to take in a little bit of Lily's attitude, which was to say, this is a chart that's going to describe a Harris victory, and let me tell you why. Whether or not it actually did, that's a dip. But if I'd seen and paid attention to more of these Mars signatures rising over the ascendant at these critical points, I think it probably would have had to have been a different deal, because Trump has Mars rising natally. And in the 2016 election, it was the same deal where Mars was angular in the Aries ingress of that year. And there was the obvious political upset then when he won over the Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton. So I want to just quickly show you, if you can just cast your mind back to early 2025, early last year. I know that probably feels like a decade ago. So much has happened since. But notice Saturn on the cusp of the ninth house. Notice this conjunction with the moon and Mars. There was and the ninth ruler, Jupiter, retrograde in square with both Saturn and Venus. This strong ninth house emphasis, the strong malefic emphasis in both positions. And just remember how troublesome and problematic Trump was to religious officials, how problematic he was to college campuses. I mean, I just read that this isn't even over. College campuses are still being taken to court. I believe Harvard has just been once again sued by the Trump administration, and allegedly is going to be owing money back for, yada yada. So there's so much really to think about with respect to Saturn on the ninth house cusp, and this Moon Mars conjunction on the ascendant, and how it describes this kind of thorn in the side, problematic, obstacle, instigator, and provocateur. This is the imagery that I'm kind of seeing out of this, and also the weak position of the people who are entrusted with holding checks and balances on the executive branch to respond. Congress has largely been behind Trump's every move, because we do have a Republican Congress. And then um, uh, sorry, I just saw a comment from Lynn that I want to read. It's so interesting to think that the January 20th inauguration began in 1933. That's when the shift from March 4th took place. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I said go back 100 years, and it was because if you go back much further than that, it's not going to be in Washington. Sorry, in January 20th. So, okay, so back to this particular image with Jupiter and square with Saturn. I mean, these institutions, the courts, that's a Jupiter signature, that's a ninth house signature. The Congress and legislature, depending on your point of view, that could be an 11th or ninth house theme, but certainly Jupiter and square with Saturn across these houses isn't going to help. And then this moon, ninth, 11th ruler in the eighth. So we got Venus falling in the eighth house, and Moon Mars conjunction. It's a problematic signature. A lot of this is very tense and very heated. And when Trump took office, I mean, it was, pedal to the floor almost immediately. We're going to jump into one of the actions that Trump took called Executive Order 14,000. 14160. And this executive order directs the executive branch of government, which is I mean, it is the majority part of our government is somehow involved in an executive branch administrative division, but directs the executive branch to deny birthright citizenship to U.S. born children whose mothers were unlawfully present or on temporary visas, unless the father was also a citizen or a permanent resident. So let's just clarify what birthright citizenship is. Birthright citizenship is the expectation that if you are born on American soil, then you can claim this as your home. That's all it really takes. If you were born here, you're from here. It's a major part of the way that America has understood itself for the last 150 years for reasons that we'll get into in just a moment. But this executive branch says, this executive order says, no, we won't be doing that anymore. We're not going to be providing and affirming citizenship for any U.S. born children unless the father was a citizen or permanent resident or the mother was one of these. So if they were here undocumented, here on a temporary visa, not naturalized, tough luck. So this bars federal agencies from issuing or accepting citizenship documents for the affected individuals. And so that means that the Departments of State, Justice, Homeland Security, and the Social Security Administration have to align their policies and issue implementation guidance within 30 days. So this means no passports. This means no ingress and egress out of the country. You won't necessarily be able to return Social Security Administration without a social. It'd be very difficult to exist in this country without a Social Security number. It's difficult, for instance, to go to a hospital or to be able to take insurance um, um, benefits without having these details aligned. And certainly you can't enter the formal economy in the United States without a social. You wouldn't be able to get a bank account. You wouldn't be able to get a job. You probably wouldn't be able to get a cell phone, to be honest. I mean, you probably could, but I think I remember the first time you do this, you need to establish some kind of credit, and all of these things require a social security number. So it is a major, major administrative nightmare to be implementing this. And that's not even touching the morality of this particular executive order. Now, I want you to pay attention to a couple of degrees. Look at what's on the ninth house cusp, 17 degrees of Pisces. Pay attention to the position of the ninth ruler, Jupiter, the natural significator of courts, the natural significator of um, uh, legitimizing bodies. I suppose is a good way to say it. Jupiter's a legitimizing force in mundane astrology. And That degree of 12 Gemini is going to be important. And then I'll want you to also notice the conjunction of the moon and Mars around 27 degrees of Cancer. Because now, when we turn to the chart for when the Supreme Court takes up this case about this particular executive order, we see all these degrees reactivated. What was on the ninth house is now on the 10th house cusp. Where Jupiter was is where the moon is. Where the moon and Mars is where Jupiter is now. Okay, so it's a number of very interesting repetitive signatures coming through. And so here's what happens is the Trump administration issues this executive order, but then there's a class action lawsuit that's filed in June of 2025, and it gets expedited fairly quickly within a matter of months to sit before the Supreme Court. This is one of these instances where Trump wanted something before the Supreme Court for them to make a decision, knowing that he personally had a hand in placing a number of the justices on the Supreme Court, and they are currently leaning conservative. They have, for the better part of Trump's tenure, more or less gone along with whatever he wants. I want to be respectful and say, there is room for the possibility that these justices just happen to agree with Trump's view on the world, on the United States, on how things should operate domestically and internationally, how powers should be divided. And it might, just be a case that Trump picked people who absolutely saw things his way. But there has for a long time been a concern also that there's this sense of, I scratched your back and put you on this position. The Supreme Court um, uh, placements, those are appointments for life. There are no term limits here. So this is a huge thing to put somebody on the Supreme Court. It's for that reason that, many of us have wondered to what extent is there a certain um, favoritism perhaps to President Trump's perspectives that they might be representing. But anyway, this case is now coming before the Supreme Court, and they accepted this particular case in December of 2025. I want to just point out that in the chat, Kent has shared one independent news outlet that I follow to track these legal issues is Lawfare Media. They have around at least a dozen articles tracking this, and he provides a link. And then Jane says that the moon is on the north bending here. That's right, the moon is in the square with both nodes, so emphasizes how critical the issue is. To be at the bendings of the nodes, what that means for anybody who might be new to that concept is that the moon is at its maximum northern or southern latitude with respect to the ecliptic. The ecliptic is that flat plane that the sun and all the planets orbit around. If we could get rid of the extreme brightness of the sun just so that we can kind of see out into space, what we would see is that the sun is traveling in a circle and all the other planets are moving along that circle with them, but they'll move a little bit to the north and a little bit to the south. And so the moon is right now at its maximum northern position. Well, I look at this and I think to myself, yeah, this is a huge issue. It is a massive issue. Northernness and being far north in latitude has, within the astrological tradition, been associated with prominence, lots of attention, and possibly even notoriety and power. It depends on how you read this. But the moon's in the 12th house. It rules the ascendant. Now, the ascendant in mundane astrology is going to be signifying the people. In a court case, it's a little different. So we're not looking right now at, kind of the trial chart for this particular case. That said, this is a full moon chart, so we are at perfect liberty to look at the ascendant to signify the populace of a nation. And I don't think it's by accident that the moon, as natural significator of the populace, also rules the ascendant. It's elevated in terms of latitude, yet placed in the 12th, which is an indication of being oppressed, pushed under heel. I don't think it's an accident either that the South Node is on the fourth house cusp. I mean, this is birthright citizenship. This is about disinheriting people from their own land. That is what effectively is happening here. So, um, I also, just one more time want you to remember those degrees. That Pisces degree is good to remember, but 19 degrees of Aquarius is on this cusp, and then we got 13 Gemini, around 27 Cancer. This is the chart for when we expect oral arguments to begin. So today is March 22nd. Okay, so April 1st is when we expect arguments to begin. And arguments before the Supreme Court typically start at 10 a.m. That's when sessions typically open. And it's the same degrees. I mean, we're seeing what was on the ninth house cusp when the court agreed to take this case up is now in the 10th. So I make sense of that the ninth house is showing that this is a matter for judicial review. But when it moves to the 10th house, we're talking about having an outcome, having a decision, making a choice, because the 10th house is associated with that executive function that we know comes from making a decision and issuing a directive. The ascendant is the degree of that moon. If we go back, you'll see the moon 13 degrees at the time they pick it up. I mean, look at that. And then the third house cusp is carrying the axis of that 29-degree Cancer Capricorn that I think is quite central to this astrology. Now, this is a trial chart. Okay, so we actually can look at this as a bit of a trial chart, and I recommend that we do for just a moment and just see what we can kind of see here. I need to walk you through something that's a little bit confusing because it did take me a second to get my head wrapped around this. The class action lawsuit that was filed was, I think, Barber versus Trump is the name of that case. Barber versus Trump. Oh, okay. Thank goodness. I saw in the chat that maybe you weren't seeing the slides and I just about had a heart attack. Okay. Sorry. Okay. We're all good. I can see that that's been sorted. So thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate it. Okay. The original lawsuit that went before um, a lower court was Barbara versus Trump, which means that the Trump administration would have been the defendant in that particular case. And the court ruled against the Trump administration. And now it's before the Supreme Court for an appeal on the direction of the Trump administration. This is frequently what happens when it ends up before the Supreme Court, is when it's asked for appeal, well, they're not prosecutors anymore and defendants. It's not quite the same language, but there is somebody now who's petitioning and coming forward for an appeal, and so the roles switch. So now this case is actually called Trump v. Barbara. Okay, so Trump would be given to the ascendant, the ACLU and a number of other organizing bodies who are responding would then be shown by the seventh. Um, the ACLU is the American Civil Liberties Union, I believe, or I think that's the full acronym. I grew up knowing that my family couldn't stand them. They were a bad word in my house, and that's how I knew they probably were doing something really important for the rights of everyday Americans, knowing that the fundamentalist Christian household I was raised in saw these four letters written in that order as a mark of evil. Now, here are a couple things we might consider. We want to take a look at the relative position of the ascendant versus the descendant rulers to figure out who might be better positioned to win. Uh, right off the bat, we can see an immediate difference between the ascendant ruler Mercury in Pisces and the descendant ruler Jupiter in Cancer. Let's break this down. Trump's legal team is going to be shown by Mercury in Pisces. At the very best, what that suggests is that this is going to be a legal team that is hoping to contest a long-held way of operating in the United States. And I want to be very clear that birthright citizenship is enshrined in our Constitution in the amendments. We're going to talk about how birthright citizenship came to be part of the American experience and the American experiment um, in just a moment, but you'll need to understand that it's not just some policy that Trump is trying to reverse. It is something that needs to go through many official channels and receives, I think majority votes, super majority votes, maybe even in some cases when it comes to constitutional changes and amendments, which would also require state ratification. It's a huge process, which Trump can't stand. I listen to people who are talking about Trump day in, day out. And what I never hear from them, they're always thinking he's playing three-dimensional, I don't know, chess. And in my mind, it's not a game of checkers or a game of chess. This person has spent his entire life at the top of private organizations. He doesn't understand teamwork. He doesn't understand checks and balances. He doesn't understand why he can't just say, this is what we're doing now, and it doesn't work. His expectation is if I say we're doing it, somebody's out there who's got the willpower and the capacity to make it happen and make it work. And if you just have to be loud, scream, shout, do whatever it takes to push it forward and to make sure that this is what happens, then go for it. So Trump often trips up on himself when, just like, recently the Supreme Court handed him an incredibly humiliating defeat just before the State of the Union address. Um, yeah, Mark says Trump's not playing three-dimensional chess. He's a one-dimensional thug. That's exactly right. He is a bully. Everything, everything about Trump's demeanor and his behavior is Exactly what you see on a playground among 8-year-olds who are learning social cues from one another. And there's always the one bully who's a little bit behind on understanding that kindness gets you further. And this is, kind of Trump's MO. So his legal team being shown by Mercury and Pisces, what that tells me, Mercury is a planet that likes to contest things, but it's in Pisces, which suggests that it's not really going to be in its best element to kind of respond and make a case for itself, which is what just happened. I know I started a sentence and didn't finish it. That just before the State of the Union address a couple of weeks ago, the Supreme Court um, ruled that the tariffs that Trump imposed sweeping tariffs across the board, all these changes that he would make with backroom deals and all, these are things you can do in a boardroom. They're things that you can do with your bit. You can make arrangements. You could make these kind of deals. But levying taxes and tariffs is explicitly enumerated amongst the powers of Congress, who was not involved in any of these decisions. And so the Supreme Court came back and said, you have no constitutional authority or right to do these things. And so they need to be rolled back. So we have recently seen a little bit of shaky relationship now forming between the Supreme Court and Trump, and many of us could finally breathe for a second, thinking, thank God. And if you watch the State of the Union address, it's better than comedy actually when it gets to the point of the justices sitting in the front row, the ones who have always kind of bent the law over to whatever Trump was looking for. The one time that they decided to go against his wishes, they couldn't keep their eyes open. The camera was on their faces. They were blinking nonstop. They were trying to break eye contact. It's like they felt shame or intensity, and you could just see in Trump's face that he knew that they were feeling uncomfortable. And he pushed and he dug and he had unkind things to say about the justices in the front row. It was really shocking. But at the same time, I have no sympathy for those particular justices. And, you can't blame a lion for mauling you when put in a corner. So I don't think it's a good start, even though Mercury's in the 10th house for it to be placed in Pisces. I certainly don't think that Mercury in Pisces in the 10th has anything that could really stand up to Jupiter in Cancer. You have to think about Jupiter in Cancer not only being exalted, okay, but it is a superior planet. I mean, who wants to see a fight between Hermes and Zeus? There's no contest there. They have completely different jobs, but if you're going to put them to task of determining which one of them is the smarter, which one of them is the stronger, which one of them is going to succeed, then you would need to see Mercury in exceptional condition and Jupiter in really poor condition to judge that Mercury is going to get the one up in this instance. So already on a level of planetary superiority, it's leaning toward keeping birthright citizenship enshrined in our Constitution just where it is in the 14th Amendment. But there are other things to consider. The first is that in any type of war chart, and honestly, a trial chart is a war chart, so any type of war chart, to see one belligerent making an application to the other suggests that they will eventually be forced to yield. And you can see that Mercury, Trump's legal team, is making an application by trying to Jupiter. This might suggest that there is some decision in other instances where it was possible to perhaps retract the suit or the request for appeal. I don't know if that's actually even possible once something's before the Supreme Court to have it pulled back. I think that it's already in motion, so what's coming is already coming. But it certainly isn't helpful for the person who's coming toward for the appeal to do so at a time when the moon is in an exact opposition with Saturn. I mean, if there is a signature of a bummer out there, that's the one. In opposition with Saturn is going to be indicating hard realities that are going to have to hit. And I also think that there's going to be a pretty, with Saturn and Aries, that's going to be a pretty scathing response. Saturn and Aries, I wouldn't be looking to that planet necessarily to pull its punches or to be light and deferential. That's not going to be Saturn at its best, at its most reserved, which we might see with Saturn in Libra, but not so much here. And then immediately after the opposition with Saturn is the opposition with the Sun, and the Sun would represent judgments in general in cases like this. So I just want to start by saying I have a very hard time seeing this chart suggesting anything favorable for Trump and his legal team in the appeal. And if there was nothing else really jumping out there, which I think there's plenty, all the things I've said I think are enough. But I would like to add that the defending team's angle, 13 degrees of Sagittarius, that is the US ascendant, which I believe is 12 Sagittarius. And then Jupiter is right on the US sun. I think that this is a very clear message that the ACLU and the rest of the legal team representing Barbara in the Trump v. Barbara lawsuit will be making every case imaginable that what Trump's administration has done is attack the very heart and nature of America itself, and that will and need be protected. Is this making sense so far? I'm not saying you need to agree with me or my judgment on this one chart alone. I've got a few other places to take us. Um, okay, good. Thank you for that note in the chat. I appreciate it. So, I want to take you on a very quick tour about where birthright citizenship came from. And to do so, we need to start with a very heartbreaking story about Dred Scott. Dred Scott was an enslaved person who lived in Missouri, which was a slaveholding state. So, if you, this is a map of the United States. This light green area, these were territories. They were not yet. Maybe we should go back so you can see. They were not yet states. California was a state at this time, and then these other everywhere else where there are clean boundaries are states. These green areas were territories. You can see that this was all of New Mexico. It would eventually be split into Arizona and New Mexico, this wide Kansas region, and Utah region and Nebraskan region. They will all be split into states with time. These green states are where slavery is illegal. The red states is where slavery is still permitted and within legal code. This is a whole history about how this happened, but we're not going to get into it. This light red, there was something of a middling, you couldn't continue, for instance, to have slaves or to purchase enslaved people in these states, but you could continue to export them to slaveholding states. So it was a bit of a messy situation then. But Dred Scott and his and those who were with him moved to Wisconsin with his enslaver. And after 4 years of being in Wisconsin, Dred Scott had the expectation that he lives in a state where slavery is not legal, and he's been there long enough. It wasn't as if they were just traveling there. They've now been living there for 4 years, and so he's a freed man, and he should be able to go about his life freed. Now, I want to show you. Well, this ended up as a court case, which did go before the Supreme Court. This is the astrological chart here to the right. I'll just zoom in for just a moment. This is the astrological chart for the decision. It was announced on March 6th, 1857. And it's been a tradition for a very long time. I did as much research as I could, and I can't be 100% certain that the decision was issued at 10 a.m. But with the research that I found, it suggested that the 10 a.m. reading of justice decisions actually began in the early 1800s. I just couldn't verify that with a second source. And so I have to say that I feel confident enough to show you this chart without saying that I'm so confident that I would swear by it. So let's just, call it what it is. But we know the date. We know it was on March 6th, 1857, when this was decided by the Supreme Court. And you're looking at Justice Taney, who wrote the majority opinion of the court, which was to say that um, uh, black people were not considered citizens. The 14th Amendment, or sorry, the what's the word that I'm looking for? The laws that applied to the northern states where slavery was illegal couldn't possibly apply to Dred Scott because he wasn't an American citizen. He was property. And so there's no way for that law to apply to him. And I want you to take a look at the astrology of this chart because it is really, really striking. Notice a couple of degrees that have come up. We've already, talked about some of these. So, the sun is at that same 16 degrees of Pisces. If you remember, that was on the midheaven um, of that first chart that we looked at, which was the Trump inauguration chart. Sorry, it was in the ninth house cusp of the Trump inauguration chart. And then it was at the midheaven for the chart when the Supreme Court decided to take up the current case about the executive order Trump issued. Mercury is also on a familiar position of 20 degrees of Aquarius. We'd highlighted that. Um, and the moon is at 28 degrees of Cancer. I hope these degrees are familiar to you. If they're not, I can just go back for just a moment to kind of illustrate. I mean, there was the 20 degrees. That's where Mercury was at the Dred Scott decision. This is where the sun was in the Dred Scott decision. This is where the moon was in the Dred Scott decision. Okay. And this moon is very close. Certainly the 12th house is, which is a house that is understandably associated with the themes of, depriving somebody of citizenship. I'm thinking that makes a good deal of sense to me to consider looking at it from that perspective. And that ends up, that 12th house cusp was 2 degrees of Gemini, and that's on the ascendant here at 10 a.m. So there's a lot of very interesting resonances between this decision and the astrology for the Supreme Court taking up the case in 2025 for it to be reviewed this year in 2026. I'm also reminded that there is a traditional aphorism that the judge in a case will not judge to his honor. That is the exact language. Will not judge to his honor if the ruler of the 10th house is Saturn and Saturn is debilitated and afflicted. And in this case, what we can see is a very debilitated and afflicted Saturn. It's stationing, it's in the sign of Cancer, and it's also in square with Mars. There's a separating square between Mars, which is a tough and afflicting planet, and ruler of the 12th house. Quite an unfortunate collection of symbolism here. And also notice, the south node is at 6 degrees of Libra, the north node at 6 degrees of Aries. I mean, when we talked about the oral arguments being expected, that's where the moon and Saturn will be. So, it's everything about that original Dred Scott decision is coming back into full focus here in 2025. Now, I have come to find that it's my favorite thing to do right now, which is to look at planetary ingresses into signs. If I'm interested in law, if I'm interested in what anybody who's signified by Jupiter is doing, any institution that might be signified by Jupiter, what they are doing, then I want to take a look at the ingress of Jupiter, the most recent ingress of Jupiter into a sign. So you can see that Dred Scott was decided when Jupiter was at 13 degrees of Aries. Okay, Dred Scott was decided when Jupiter's at 13 Aries. So I'm going to look at when Jupiter moved into 0 degrees of Aries and take a look at the angles here, the astrology. It's just absolutely fascinating to me because we have the same degrees. They're more or less lined up, from start to finish, pulling all of these kind of signatures together. And in this instance, the ninth ruler, Saturn, 12 degrees of Cancer, and also the moon ruling the ascendant in opposition with Mars, right? So all of these things would also indicate that this would not be a good time for decisions coming out of the court, the Supreme Court. Certainly something will come through this period that is very harsh and will be looked upon as inducing senses of shame and hardship and difficulty on the people involved. Now, this particular Jupiter in Aries, I mean, just remember these 19 degrees of Pisces, 9 Cancer, 3 degrees of Leo, this opposition between the moon and Mars at Leo and Aquarius. I mean, this is the astrology of the Trump administration. That's largely, what I see. But also we see these same degrees being activated, from when the Supreme Court takes up the case. It's the same angles. 5 Cancer, 14 Pisces on the midheaven. I mean, we're talking hundreds of years apart, and we've got the exact same angles. Pluto is now coming to enter into that Moon Mars opposition. We'll talk about the uh, uh, Trump administration's um, astrology, but I just want to remind you that the Trump administration astrology has the moon at 3 degrees of Leo. So this three Leo, five Aquarius opposition, it's bringing all of that whole story right back into focus here in 2025. And so now, when we take a look at that astrology, kind of up against this current case, this is again the chart when the oral arguments are expected to begin. The symbolism is so stark, and we can see a lot of overlapping signatures here, which suggests, that this is an opportunity. Because what are the options? I mean, the options here is that we go back to the Dred Scott decision and say, no, you're not a citizen. You do not have a right to be called a citizen. We either go back there or we affirm what happened in the 14th Amendment. So let's talk about the 14th Amendment. So this decision, that um, the previously enslaved individuals, or maybe even currently enslaved individuals, were not citizens. It had that was that. What was the year of this? This was in 1857. So when we get to 1865. Into the 1860s, this is when the American Civil War is fought and won by the North. And in 1865, there are a series of amendments to the Constitution that are written with the express intent of making sure that we are not going to go back to the, two-tier system that we had before. I'm really giving broad strokes here because at no one who studied this period would even begin to suggest that at that stage, rights were immediately recognized for Black Americans at that time. That's not what happened, but there was a movement toward um, wanting to make sure that we enshrined the Union victory in our Constitution because there was a lot of spiritual impetus at this time, political impetus to kind of rally around the eradication of slavery, and there was a recognition also that we can't just make this a law because if we make it a law. That anybody who's born here is a citizen, for instance, or, if we want to fix what happened with Dred Scott, yeah, we've got a Congress today and a president today who's favorable to our position, but all it's going to take in 50 years, maybe even less, maybe there would be a pendulum swing in the other direction in 15 or 20 years. And all of that could be undone with a stroke of a pen. We need to go deeper on this. And so this is where we see the implementation of the amendment to the Constitution articles. There were 3 articles that were written touching on different points that needed to be addressed. And the purpose of doing it through the Constitution was that it was very difficult and it remains very challenging to change the Constitution. It requires um, an incredible amount of consensus, not just within the legislative and executive branches of government, but the states also need to all get on board. It's a pretty big deal. Now, here's the language that opens up Article 14. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Okay, now this particular quote and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, if that, kind of tickled your spidey senses, then that, hold on, what does that mean exactly? I think you've picked up on something. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But I want to show you this is a full Jupiter return later because Jupiter has returned to Aries when this issue gets redressed. And here is the 14th Amendment ratification astrology. This is the astrology for the full moon just before its ratification. And look at this. The sun is on the United States sun. We have this buildup on the ninth house cusp that really, I think, is bringing the same degrees forward 27 degrees Cancer, all of this. Now, the nation just came out of a very violent, very challenging, very difficult period of war. And the period that comes after is called the Reconstruction because there was a lot in this country that needed to be rebuilt out of this. Okay. You can see that there's a Mars Saturn opposition on the angles, 2 degrees of Gemini in opposition to Saturn at 29 Scorpio. It's separating, mutually separating. I mean, the war is behind us only by a series of like months. I mean, this happened very quickly. It was in April that the victory happened, and then we're talking about the amendment being ratified in July. So it's 3 months later, 3 degrees separated between Mars and Saturn. But I want you to look at the signatures here. We'll recall this in a little bit, but the US Sun, this Mercury Venus position in the ninth house, the moon being in the second. So what does that, do? One of the things in mundane astrology that really stand out to me is how often the second house is associated with well, things like armies, for instance, but it really is about the resources of a nation. And so the indication that, these people who have been denied citizenship, this is the moon in Capricorn, mind you, right? So these are people who are, pushed into very difficult position. Um, are now being recognized as belonging here, and now being recognized as being part of this a part of this nation. So Marx says to be even-handed, most liberal democracies do not grant automatic citizenship to a person simply born in the territory of their country. You don't need to be a neo-Confederate to make that point. Well, that might be true, but most liberal democracies did not have American-style slavery, racialized slavery, and the history of, where we're about to take this. It was, I think, a necessary part of our history, our nation, my nation's need to recover from this. Also, I don't know if that's true. I don't think it's most liberal democracies don't. I think the ones that America would call her peers, I think, do have some semblance of a law similar to this. I wanted to have a slide actually that showed a map because I did do that research, which nations do have birthright citizenships and which don't. And it was my dad used to tell me no one else does this. He was very wrong. Many, many other nations do this. And even if they don't, doesn't matter. It's still part of the American psyche and the American identity. And it helps to minimize, I think, risk of, racialized marginalization of individuals as they come in to this nation. Now, this is the ingress of Jupiter into Aries that happened this time around. And you may not remember all of these degrees like I'd hoped you would, but um, before, if you remember when in the Dred Scott case, there was a Mars Saturn square. Saturn was in Cancer. Well, now Uranus is there. So there is a Mars Uranus square, but it's kind of breaking apart the original law that was put forward. And we can see that the ninth ruler is now in a much stronger position. And Venus is also on that 15 degrees of Gemini, which was showing up at the moon's position in some of our charts that we've looked at and the ascendant. So some of the similar degrees kind of popping up. Well, this article that was brought into the American Constitution in 1868, very shortly thereafter received a challenge. And Mark, you actually made reference to this earlier today, that this is a case before. This is the photo that you see here of a man named Wong Kim Ark. He was born in San Francisco, and he was born to Chinese immigrant parents. And there was at the time um, a kind of an anti-immigrant, anti-Chinese dynamic that was happening between both the legislative and the executive branch of government. There's more of a history there than we can get into today. I just want to say that this individual, he had not been home to China in many years, so he left to go home and visit his family in China, and then he was denied re-entry into the United States, saying that he wasn't a citizen and he didn't have a right to enter. Again, this is a time where there wasn't a whole lot of goodwill between the American government toward uh, Chinese nationals or Chinese immigrants or people who descended from either of those individuals. So it was a bit of a tough situation. But he said, but I was born in the United States, and the Constitution is very clear that that means that um, that I'm an American citizen. And he sued, and then it went before the Supreme Court. And the argument that came before the Supreme Court was about that phrase that I showed you on the other side. Subject to the jurisdiction thereof. What the argument was being made was that this individual's parents were subject to the jurisdiction of China because they were Chinese immigrants and they were not U.S. citizens. And so as a result, their son would also be subject to the laws of China, and that article in the Constitution is not meant to focus on immigrants, for instance. It was just meant to deal with the black population that was already in the United States, and that was it. So it is very, ugly case. But I think one thing that we can feel very good about is that the Supreme Court ruled 6-2 in favor of Wong Kim Ark and said, no, absolutely, this is exactly what this article was intended to do. It was intended to protect the or the birthright citizenship status of children of immigrants or people who are here for any reason. If those individuals are here legally, and these people are subject to the laws of this land, here we are. And that was effectively the case that was made. You can see in the astrology for when this decision was made that there is somewhat different themes. There's a Sun Jupiter opposition, which I think is a little bit more favorable than the Mars Saturn square that we saw in other configurations. And then there's also, a strong Gemini signature. Of course, at the time, Pluto certainly wouldn't have been known. I'm not sure I remember when Neptune was discovered. It seems reasonable to suspect that it would have been around that time that Neptune would have been known about. So maybe it would have been in the astrology there. But yep, Sun, Venus, Mars conjunction in the 11th. And the preceding Jupiter and Libra ingress had a strong flavor of Libra in general. With Venus and Jupiter very close to the midheaven. 1930, isn't that Pluto, Paula? I'm pretty sure Pluto is 1930, not Neptune. Correct me though. I mean, I'll be watching. 1846. Thanks, Lynn. I appreciate that. So yeah, it would have been known by then. But there are, some elements of I mean, first of all, this chart is not meant to respond only to the Supreme Court case. So you know, I looked at this and I wrestled all night with like, oh, but why is the moon conjunct Saturn? And, it's in the 12th house. Surely that shouldn't have been very helpful for anybody. But I mean, largely, I have to remember that this chart has a lot of work to do. It has to talk about the nature of law and judicial behavior for the entire year that Jupiter moved through Libra. So not just this case, all of the other cases that would go before the Supreme Court. Um, we're going to go over a little bit, but not by too much. Just giving you a heads up. I'm in flow, so we're just going to keep going. Um, the thought, though, about, a Moon Saturn conjunction in the 12th house at the final degrees of its sign, almost this image of being able to move past this burden and this hardship of Saturn, half the burden, past the burden and hardship of Scorpio. Immediately, both of those planets move into Sagittarius and will make a sextile that is received to Jupiter and then a sextile with Venus. So it seems to me that actually what's being kind of described here is a Precarious court case for sure, but one that's largely going to end with a bit of a relief instead of a sense of bricks around one's neck. So, for that reason, looking at all of that astrology, I've already laid out my expectation that this astrology doesn't look good to me, that Trump will win this. I think it seems very reasonable to expect that birthright citizenship will be affirmed, will be upheld by the court. I wouldn't even be surprised if there's a bit of a scathing response about the attack of, important American institutions. That language, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. I didn't include this slide just in the interest of time, but I went back and took a look at all the instances that I could find, which were maybe about six or seven, where there were court cases that effectively were challenging that particular amendment. This Wong Kim Ark was not the first, sorry, was not the only person to have gone before the courts, having to defend their birthright citizenship as a result of people wanting to interpret that particular phrase to suggest that it's a loophole that you can push somebody out of birthright citizenship by simply suggesting that they must be under the jurisdiction of a foreign government. And universally, without exception, every court case that I found came back where the justice explicitly said, those words have been interpreted since this article's inception as meaning the following: that if you are born here, you are subject to the jurisdiction of these lands, and because you are subject to the jurisdiction, you must have the right to claim citizenship, not to suggest that this is an exception. Like if you're just because you're born here, but the exception would be for instance, like the children of diplomats. That's the exception. You have somebody like a diplomat, they are not subject to United States laws while they were here. I mean, obviously, if they choose to break them, there could be damaged relationship between their nation and ours. But it is feasible for somebody to be born here and not subject or to the jurisdiction of U.S. law. And that would be in the case of something like being the child of a diplomat, not being the child of an immigrant who has moved here. It's not, so it's part of the American ethos post Reconstruction that if you're born here, this land can be yours. This is supposed to be, give me, you're tired, you're poor, you're weak. That's the image that you get with this Sag rising, the sun in Cancer, which now Jupiter is there, Jupiter in Cancer in the American chart, which is all being reinforced at the oral arguments stage. Now, I'm just going to try something a little tricky here and see if I can make a decision based on astrological indications, if I can make an educated guess as to when I think the courts are going to issue a decision. So right now, we're stepping into, I've told you what I think is going to happen, and now I'm going to tell you when I think it's going to happen. And I'm going to be as specific as I can up to giving you an actual date. And we're just playing with this. I have no idea if what I'm doing is going to work, but we'll see. Now, this is the chart. I want to show you this. This is the chart for when Jupiter went into Gemini in, was it 2020? It would have had to be 2024. Jupiter goes into Gemini, and this is remember that the case that is before the Supreme Court now, the case that's before the Supreme Court today, happens as a result of an executive order that Trump signed when Jupiter was at 12 Gemini. So this is part of why I'm looking at Jupiter at 0 degrees of Gemini. I just want to see the astrology about how all of this came together and how it got connected. So, right, Jupiter's in Gemini. Look at the degree on the ninth house cusp. 24 degrees of Cancer. That definitely has caught my attention because I've seen it quite a few times already. And because I've already studied the 14th Amendment's ratification chart that had 22 degrees of Scorpio rising, 4 degrees of Virgo rising, I immediately, of course, will have noticed, that there is the same angles in Jupiter's ingress into Gemini. This is why I'm such a believer about ingresses into signs. You got to start using these in your work. I'm telling you, it's absolutely shocking and really quite powerful stuff. Um, I have to be honest, I'm not following the chat. It's moving quickly, and I can't read these big paragraphs while also talking, so I just have to leave it. But we'll open the mic up for questions maybe later. I also noticed that there's this Jupiter-Venus conjunction, and that is reminding me of the chart where there was the Jupiter-Venus conjunction when the in the Wong our Kim case where his citizenship was upheld. So I think that's already an argument that this is probably not going to go in Trump's direction. But these three planets, Jupiter, Venus, and the Sun, they are transits to the amendment's Mars. So you can perhaps appreciate why this particular amendment is being challenged now and why it's being pushed up for discussion with the Supreme Court. Now, I know these charts are a little bit small right now, but I think you should be able to see whatever we need you to in just a moment here. Um, the point being, what did I want to say? Oh, yes, that the moon is in Capricorn also with the 14th Amendment. And then when Jupiter went into Gemini, it was very close to the same position in Capricorn. So there's a number of things that seem striking. Um, right, I didn't mean to include that, my bad. Now, Jupiter in Gemini, great. We have that astrology for when this got brought forward, but now we need to kind of make a decision for ourselves as to when it seems most likely that this is going to be decided by the courts. So the courts typically issue decisions in June on Mondays. They might issue a decision on Tuesdays. There is precedent for that, but only when the docket is really full. And they tend to try to get as much done as possible in the earlier days in June. Okay, but it has also been known for some of these cases to get pushed, especially if they're politically loaded, if they're really challenging, if the decision within the court was a little bit divided. The more challenging it is, the more time that they need to prepare the majority and the dissenting opinions, they might push that decision to come out in July. Okay, so let's take a look at the two Jupiter ingresses here. This is the current one, and this is only going to be good until I think it's June 28th or something like this. So it's the first part of the Supreme Court's period for where we expect this decision to be issued. So let's look at this astrology. I mean, it's fine. I don't see anything that's really reminding me of the original astrology at all. Like I don't personally see it too strongly in here. Okay, Jupiter's in Cancer, that's fine. And the sun is kind of close to that Gemini degree. But nothing else is really singing here. I feel very differently about the chart for Jupiter into Leo. I want to point out for you that this has the moon at 11 Capricorn in opposition to the sun at 8 degrees of Cancer. It's the almost exact positions that we had for the sun and moon when the amendment was ratified. We also have this conjunction of the a stationing Mercury and Jupiter, 26 Cancer, 0 Leo, 27 Cancer, 0 Leo, right? Okay, so you see this kind of same signature, right? So that definitely is getting my attention. And then Mars Uranus conjunction is returning to the amendment ratification position of 2 degrees of Gemini. Now, because it's conjoining with Uranus, I expect that it's very possible that what happens as a result of this decision, one way or the other, can really kick up a lot of dust. And it might be for that reason that the court decides to issue their guidance late. Really, the Jupiter and Leo ingress, it makes the most sense to me that the Jupiter ingress into Leo would be pointing to, because that happens at the end of June. So that kind of means that the case would need to be brought out in July, really. I mean, I think the Jupiter makes its ingress into Leo on a Tuesday, and typically these issues are decided on a Monday. So that kind of means we have to wait a whole week, which is going to be the first week in July. So let's take a look at the astrology of, um, there we go. Um, I want to show you the only two Mondays that really seem sensible. There's a June 29th. I can't re these, these are two possibilities. I'm not sure what to expect. I have my favorite, and I'll tell you which one I think it's going to be. So there's the decision window. This is Monday, 10 a.m. We know when the justices read their decision. It happens at 10 a.m. Um, this one that happens on June 29th still has Jupiter in Cancer, so it's not my favorite because the Jupiter hasn't made its ingress into the next sign. There is a Moon Sun opposition in the appropriate signs. Saturn's on the ninth house cusp. Those things feel a little bit familiar. But then there's this 28 degrees of Leo on the ascendant. And that throughout most of Trump's term, anytime that degree gets triggered, it tends to favor Trump and it tends to favor what he's asking for and what he's looking for. I much prefer the chart for July 6th at 10 a.m., which is a Monday, because on at this time, look at what's rising. Monday, July 6th, 2026, 4 degrees of Virgo, which is the midheaven for when the amendment got ratified in the first place. And I believe if I don't want to lose anybody, but I almost think, shall I just check one thing here? See that? Right. And then in this period, the Jupiter in Aries period, right? When the 14th Amendment was ratified, the moon is at 29 degrees of Pisces and the North Node at 3 degrees of Virgo. So let's come back and look at this chart again, and you'll find the moon at 29 degrees of Pisces and 4 degrees of Virgo on the ascendant. And also, we still have that same, yes, and then Lynn's mentioning the August 24th lunar eclipse will be at that degree. Um, the August 24th will be at, right. Wow. Well, that's quite interesting. I mean, I'm not familiar with the decisions coming out in August, so I wonder what that might mean. I wonder if there might be a rally or an attempt to do something differently, or maybe move for the need for a constitutional amendment. And it's possible that they will try to take it there. But mostly, I'm really compelled by the fact that the sun is in the same degree, 13 degrees Cancer when this amendment came into being. And this is the Monday when it's, at 14 degrees of Cancer, largely in the same position. We have that conjunction of like 0 Leo and 24 Cancer, which was right here on the ninth house cusp at that same time. So I'm thinking it's going to be one of these two. If I had to put my money behind one, it would be on July 6th. But if I had $100 to spend and I needed to put money down and to make money, I would probably hedge my bets a little bit and I'd put probably 65 bucks on this one and 35 bucks on that one and just see what, maybe not even, maybe 70 over here because just too much is kind of coming together. All right, so that kind of concludes my presentation. I won't have time to read the chat. Well, let's see. I mean, should I? There's so much text here. Are there any questions or comments that maybe somebody wants to unmute themselves? Maybe that would
No,
be.
it's Jane. I just wanted to know how are you looking at the 11th house from
Hey, sorry, Jane, could you move your back from the mic a little bit? I can't make out what you're saying.
um
Yeah, it sounds like you're underwater.
that's my issue. Never mind.
Why don't you just type it real quickly? I can look for that one question, no problem.
Uh-huh.
Are there any other questions or comments? Okay. All right, so I guess we'll see. I mean, if I'm right, then I'm right and fantastic. And if I'm not, then there were plenty of us
Say,
present for me to be
JD,
wrong.
just to say, Wade, have you looked at the charts for there's two charts for the Supreme Court itself?
No, I haven't. And I
That's
think
quite
that
interesting.
the time will come when I need to because we've been talking a lot about Supreme Court reform. And I think it's very possible that if the Supreme Court does what Trump doesn't like, he may be pushing in that direction immediately. And that may be where the Supreme Court's own chart becomes a really strong reference point, at least in my mind.
I think
Jane
there's
asked,
two
"Are you?"
charts.
Sorry, go ahead,
Go on.
Mark.
Yeah, the first chart is not. It wasn't Corate. The Supreme Court wasn't Corate the first day, and then so they had to meet again. A bit like the
Yeah.
federal constitution. The first time the Congress met, they weren't Corate either. The Mercury retrograde, of course,
Yeah.
at the time when the Congress met.
Right. Interesting. Well, thank you for that. But no, I haven't looked at those. And I'll be honest, I've never seen them, so I also don't know what's in them. It never occurred to me to look at the chart for the Supreme Court. It's embarrassing for an astrologer to admit that, but here I am doing it. Jane, you've asked, how are you considering the 11th as admin for the courts? I'm not. I don't know that I do consider it as admin for the courts. I just look at the ninth. Kent, I see you unmuted yourself. Do you have a
Oh,
comment or?
yeah, I had made a comment earlier just to reflect on how they Supreme Court with the nine justices, there's sort of like political factions that go beyond what the law says,
Uh-huh.
and that the decisions they're making aren't necessarily based upon the law anymore.
Right.
They're kind of just making up stuff that is they're actually creating entirely new like protocols. They're have a whole shadow docket.
Yeah, exactly.
Basically they're a political entity that is an extension of other entities that maybe go above and beyond the founding charts of what the Supreme Court even is. And so I'm just curious if you've looked at any of those other aspects of like the kind of dissolution of the rule of law in the United States and whether or not, are there new charts to look at in order to get a better beat? Because if they come back and basically rule against birthright citizenship when you're looking at these other charts, then maybe those don't have weight. So I'm just curious how you start
Sure.
to reckon that because you have these nine justices that have very distinct views
Yeah.
that don't always follow what actually the law says.
First of all, I agree with everything that you have said. And I think in the beginning of the presentation, we were kind of making, without being a little bit maybe too politicized, just making the point to say that there has been a lot of concern about what the Supreme Court has been doing, but not just the Supreme Court, even lower courts. There's just, big question marks about the health of the American judicial system. Now, to answer your question about, maybe there are new charts, I just want to say, let's step away from courts for a second. I have a birth chart. And when I fall ill, my body's not operating the way it should be. It's doing things that it's possibly designed to do, but it's been invaded by this outside force that's got its own agenda, and the body's doing what it can to respond to it. And so there might be astrology, like a decumbrature chart, for instance, or some kind of medical astrological chart that would give me the information I need to understand about this battle that's happening within the court or within my body. But I wouldn't have a new birth chart because my body is now done something different and unusual, if that makes sense. So if I was to extend that by metaphor, I wouldn't expect there to be a new chart for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is what it is, and then it will change and grow. It is subject to attack. It is subject to decline, like everything. So that would be my attitude toward it for now. But I will also tell you that that is at least partially informed by my own laziness. It's not actually laziness, but I do think that I already feel that the type of astrology I work with is highly fractal. I'm looking at connections across many different points in time. All of the astrology that I work with is always in a nested system. So, uh, Saturn Jupiter conjunctions, and then underneath those, what are the smaller cycles that fit, that whole kind of cascading tree of interconnections. And so I need to simplify where I can. So I try to start with charts that I know work and just stop asking questions from there because there's more than enough to do with those. But I do think that the time to look at the Supreme Court charts it's now here. It seems very unlikely that if Trump, for instance, I just would like to say, if Trump, for instance, was to make some kind of, I want to show you, if the Supreme Court was to make this decision, oh my God, I'm trying to zoom in here. If the Supreme Court does make the decision before July, so I told you I think maybe June 29th, I think that, or 28th, whatever is on the next slide, or the July 6th. If they don't do those dates, but they do it while Jupiter's still in Cancer on this chart, maybe there's a possibility that the reason that I'm wrong is because I'm not what I'm looking for is an assumption that the court issues the decision and it's so widely received that that's the end of the discussion. There's also the possibility, however, that it happens with Jupiter in Cancer, and I would just like to draw attention to the fact that this 25 degree of Leo Mars, this is the Jupiter in Cancer chart that I think it was in 2025 when Jupiter made its ingress into Cancer. You know, that 25 degrees of Leo is on the Trump administration's midheaven. It's Trump's ascendant. It's his own Mars. And it is the site of both an eclipse that happens in August, a solar eclipse at 20 degrees. And then shortly thereafter in November, there is a collection of Mars, Jupiter, and the South Node at 25 degrees exactly. They all come together, all three of them at 25 Leo. It is entirely possible that Trump, in response to a decision that he does not like, decides to intervene in the courts in some way, pack the court, start making extrajudicial announcements, and suddenly we have 20 Supreme Court justices. So I think the window of time where I have the luxury of not looking at those charts is now behind us. So it's going to have to, I think, come pretty soon. Nancy, oh, you have to unmute yourself, but
Yes,
I,
got
yeah,
it. Okay. Wait, I have this whole technique of looking at ingress charts and
yeah,
prior lunation charts is new to me and
ah,
so exciting. I have a technical question about it.
yes,
I think that what I'm seeing here is that you can take an ingress chart
hmm,
and compare it to a prior lunation chart
uh-huh.
and just sort of mix and match all of that.
Well, I am following. Yes, I mean that's a yes, but you have to also understand that I started my astrological career specializing in a branch of astrology called horary. Most of the
Yeah.
people who are here will know that. So,
Mhm.
horary astrology, you have to get really confident in being able to issue a decision about what an astrological signature is saying. That's was a skill that became very helpful as I started to move into electional astrology, where I'm comparing birth charts plus um, maybe a time in the future when we want to do something, start adding multiple, charts in different contexts. And it was only a natural thing for me to learn how to link these things. But it became, I think, clear to me when I was moving in the mundane part of my career, which started in 2016 when I was looking at the first Trump administration. Well, it was a campaign at the time. He hadn't won yet. But what I realize is there's just so many moments that happen where I cannot tell. I don't know if it happened at 10 a.m. or 5 p.m. I've got no idea. We just know this decision happened on this day. And even if it's like, looking into the past, you may not even get a specific day. You may just get like it happened in the first week of whatever. So you need a way to be able to take a look at the things that happened within that window. I started playing with new or full moon charts because that's what Ptolemy did. I mean, we were talking about this a little bit in Michael's talk in the chat. There was a bit of a discussion there in the chat box. But the Ptolemy used when because Ptolemy was not able to determine when Saturn and Jupiter made an exact conjunction. They moved so slowly, and the tools that they had in the second century to be able to met or earlier to measure how close they were. I mean, you could be hours, days out. In fact, even in the 12th century, Ibn Ezra said that um, they've done really good work when they even can be exactly right about the day of a conjunction. And this is the reason why mean conjunctions became popularized. It's the only place in astrology where you see the mean motion or mean position of a planet being used is in the Saturn Jupiter mean conjunction. And the only reason for it was because they didn't know when these planets would be conjoined. If you can't even get the day right, you've got zero hope of getting the ascendant in midheaven. And all of traditional astrology is built, I think, on this kind of expectation for the ascendant and midheaven to be defined. So they're using mean conjunctions. And what Ptolemy did was he said, well, here's the workaround. We're going to look at the preceding lunation, new moon or full moon. So I just adopted that. And as a result, I've also started to extend my thinking. Well, if the sun's moving into Aries and that's telling us something specific, why wouldn't Jupiter moving into a new sign tell us something? And when you start thinking about actually the ancient authors talk about those things. They do. We just don't see a lot of worked examples of it. So I'm trying to bring that into popular focus now. I'll be honest, I don't see a lot of it myself. In fact, I can't remember a time when I've seen it. I don't want to say I just want to be careful with what I say right now, but I'm just saying I don't know that this was introduced to me. So It's something that I think I kind of slowly reasoned out and finding now passages in historical literature where they seem to be saying the same thing. We just don't ever see examples of it. So I don't want to give you the sense that it's a mix and match. There is a methodology that there are things I'm doing and things I am not doing, but this isn't really about the technique so much as just the story. So I didn't get into all that.
Very interesting. And I would assume it would be fun to play around with that and see if it applies to other natal astrology as well as mundane.
The bigger you are, the more a planet's ingress into something will have an impact on you. So if you're a nation, that's a bigger deal than if you're a person, but of course it will have some kind of relevance. The
Right.
place where I find this particular idea easiest to access is when you read the traditional literature about weather. This is how it's always happened for me, is that I learn about medical astrology and actually it completely transforms how I do natal astrology. I read about weather astrology and it changes how I do everything else. It's like there's a principle that's embedded and very visible here, and then it's one of these moments where, well, there's nothing that works in astrology in only one application. It works everywhere. You just have to learn how to recontextualize it. So with weather astrology, you're looking at Mercury's ingresses into every sign. That is the one of the traditional principles, along with the new and full moons. And that's because Mercury is about change of weather and shifting of winds. It's just that simple. So I think it's definitely a technique you can play with, and I think it pays dividends. I have a great time with it. But I do think it's probably, I can see a lot of people are like, it's time to go for me. It's time to
Yeah.
go. I know it's been late. So I just want to close down on a reminder and memorial for my friend and colleague Lee Lehman, who passed away this past week, just a few days before the Aries ingress on the 18th of March. Lee was here for the very first World Astrology Summit. She's going to be greatly missed. I am very proud to have been able to call her friend and mentor and colleague, and for those of you who knew her, I think you're quite lucky too. Okay, I guess that'll be it for me today. Thank you, everybody. I'm so happy to have had um, so many of you join the conference, and there were a number of you who have come for the first time. So it was lovely having you. Very grateful for you, and I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. Thanks.